Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Hi guys, welcome to Holy Spirits. It's a new podcast where we dive into the gospel with a little help from our beverages of choice.
Jesus met people where they were, at tables, over meals, with stories that made the sacred feel ordinary and the ordinary feel sacred. Holy Spirits follows that same tradition, creating space for honest, authentic conversations about faith, just as he did.
Holy Spirits can be found on all Studio Wesley Annex channels. Remember, drink responsibly, avoid excessive alcohol use, and always follow John Wesley's first general rule: do no harm.
Hey y'all, welcome to Holy Spirits, where we take faith seriously, but not too seriously. This is a space where the sacred meets the ordinary, where big theological ideas mix with real-life conversations, and where, like Jesus at the table, we're here for good conversation, good company, and maybe even a little transformation along the way. We're kicking things off today with a story from Luke 5, Jesus inviting a tax collector to follow him, share a meal with others, and completely confuse the religious elite. And let's be honest, if Jesus was here today, some people would still be side-eyeing his guest list. So what does it mean that Jesus made space for the outsiders, the unexpected, and, well, people like us? That's what we're here to explore, without pretense, without judgment, and with plenty of room for grace. So grab a seat at the table, pour yourself whatever you'd like, and let's talk about the gospel, Holy Spirit style. All right, hi y'all. Welcome to Holy Spirits, the new audiovisual podcast by Studio Wesley. I am here with two wonderful people for our first episode. We've got Anna and Jayde. Would y'all like to introduce yourselves?
Sure.
And tell us what you're drinking.
My name's Anna Swygert, and I am a provisional deacon, though this summer I will be a deacon in full connection in the Florida Conference, and I serve at UF Health Children's Hospital for a palliative care program called Streetlight, where I work with teenagers and young adults with chronic illnesses and support them through their medical journeys, play a lot of video games, make a lot of friendship bracelets. And in addition, I work at the Jayde Rasband Foundation as the Director of Community Engagement there.
My name's Jayde Rasband. I'm a provisional elder in the Oregon-Idaho Annual Conference by way of Alabama, West Florida. I work in Extension Ministry for LifeQuest, which is a donor recovery or organ procurement organization in this region of Florida. So we cover 25 hospitals around the Gainesville area for me specifically. And I help talk with families if their loved ones might meet criteria to be organ donors and help them through that process.
Had to throw the Alabama part in there. You had to. Yeah. And then I'm Tess. I'm one of the C1 interns for Studio Wesley. And I'm going to start off with the drink part of this. This is one of the best parts about this podcast. I am drinking a local Swamp Head Hazy IPA. I am 21, I'm 22. I feel old. Wow. Throwing that out there. But that's what I'm drinking. What are y'all drinking?
I'm drinking a nice little ginger ale, because I felt like I had a sip test for the people, you know?
I love that.
Do it for the people.
Which my friends and I call a little gingy moment. Mm-hmm. And I'm stealing sips of Jayde's because it's very tasty.
Mm-hmm. I have a half vanilla Coke, half Diet Coke, because Tess was very sweet to me, and they didn't have vanilla Diet Coke. So
you made your own.
We have a journey.
All right. And then to kick off this first episode of Holy Spirits, we are going to be talking about Luke 5 verses Nope, I already said that. We're going to be talking about Luke 5 verses 27 through 32. So I'm going to go ahead and read out of the NIV version and then pass it over to our actual clergy members who know what they're talking about.
Oh, stop.
Not how it works, Tess. Not how it works.
All right. So verse 27 starts with, "After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. 'Follow me,' Jesus said to him. And Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his home, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So, first thoughts, initial reactions. What you got?
The Pharisees always be Phariseeing. Yeah, I think that's always like a hard part for me is when we have these really strong personalities. And I do think part of that is probably because that's the camp I fall into, is I can get really judgmental of like who I think my people are. Like I am most judgmental of clergy. I'm most judgmental of Methodists. I'm most judgmental of Christian folk. And so I think that's what I think about for myself. Mm-hmm.
I was also thinking about how in this, I'm the Pharisee in many ways, especially the title, you know, how in the Bible, they'll like title different sections of verses and it says Jesus eats with sinners. And I thought it was interesting because like the Pharisees are the ones that name those people as sinners. They don't self-identify perhaps as that. So even the people that are translating the Bible or like editing it in many ways like fall into the Pharisees camp and are using that same language for these people. And like, even if you named it differently and it's like Jesus eats with people who culture deems sinners or like the Pharisees deem sinners, like how even just naming it, there's a correlation then of like, oh, tax collectors. And that I also stuck out to me is tax collectors and sinners are separated. That there's a distinction. Are there, you know, like maybe like is tax collectors as a whole then like a
They were pretty bad. They were pretty bad in this. That's what the cultural expectation was. They were very bad.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then is there an implication that the job itself, like is there no way to be an ethical
Right. Like
tax
it's not
collector?
the person, it's the job.
Yeah.
You know, like are there
love the sin, hate what is it? Love the sinner, hate the sin.
I guess so, but like love the tax collector, hate the collecting. I mean, and where my brain went was, is there any ethical consumption under capitalism?
We're blowing out the big guns like, early on.
Is there this whole, you know, occupation is sinful? Are these people then, if you're working a job that is considered sinful, are you sinning?
Yeah. When you pointed out, you know, the title of this section, like it just says Jesus eating with sinners. Like if the Pharisees are there, does that then put them under that same umbrella? Because it's not the sinners and the Pharisees. It's just the sinners.
Is anytime Jesus is at a table, is it Jesus eats with sinners?
The entire Bible, just Jesus eating with sinners.
Well, and like a huge thing, as I said, when we were like pre-huddling before podcast, is that like in the Gospel of Luke, table fellowship is one of the most important examples that we see of like Jesus doing the Jesus thing. And so like anytime that Jesus is at a meal, like Luke is telling whoever is reading or listening, like you need to pay attention because this moment is really important.
Yeah.
And I really like your idea of being like, who is the sinner here? Because I do think that's what Luke is trying to get us to ask. Is it the tax collectors? Is it like whoever we are deeming as sinners? Or is it the Pharisees?
Yeah.
Or is it all of them? Right? Like,
yeah. Like, what is that distinction?
Who knows, my people? Yeah.
And then one part that I really loved reading this is the metaphor at the end where it says, you know, it's not the well who need the doctor, it's the sick.
Yeah. What do we think about that?
I know. I'm like both of you being in the healthcare field.
Well, so in addition to like my jobs, I'm also a public health student. So I'm getting my master's of public health at the University of Florida. And it's interesting because we do make the assumption that like sickness is what brings you to the doctor, but then where does preventative health come into that? And so like technically we should all be seeing doctors. We live in a system where healthcare access, you know, isn't easy for everyone, but the hope is that, you know, we can all see a doctor at least once a year. You know, if you have insurance, most insurances cover, you know, one primary care visit a year, which is really helpful in long-term health, in which case like seeing a doctor, you might not be sick, but you're seeing a doctor. And it can also, they can tell you maybe you have an underlying illness that you didn't know about, right?
Yeah.
Like that's some of the beauty of these preventative health visits, is that you are able to uncover things that might be under the surface that you didn't know were happening. But the assumption then it's like, oh, you know, the only doctors are for the sick, I think is a myth.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, maybe the metaphor then is also that like we all are in need of Jesus, right? Like it's not just the sick that are in need of the doctor, like the people that are well are just as in need of it. But those that are in most critical care perhaps are the ones that need it the most at that time.
Well, I think I think what you said at the end is really important, of like what is, because I think that's something we think about in our work. And I was a trauma chaplain, or did chaplaincy in a lot of like trauma crisis situations. And you have to think through like a triaging of needs, right? Like who has the most critical need? Because at the end of the day, like, and I think this is something that's really important when we think about the difference between equality and equity is we don't all need the same things, right? Anna has lots of allergies that I do not have. I'm allergic to my sweet, perfect cat, Gus, and a few things that bloom in the state of Florida. And I'm great with my little Benadryl a day or, you know, whatever I take. Anna has to get allergy shots and do all of these different things, right? And so it would be stupid to be like, oh, Jayde and Anna both need to take these resources from the local allergist, right? Because no, at the end of the day, I don't need this, but Anna does. And so thinking through like, what are the things that people need? And I think too, as particularly at least like white passing people, as we're having this conversation of like, what does it mean to understand too that everyone has needs? Because I think for people in power, that's really uncomfortable. It's very easy. It's very comfortable to like go on the mission trip to be the one helping. It's very easy to be the helper. I've seen in my work so many people, especially older white men who have been care providers for their families, moms who have had disabled children, who have done everything for their people. And then they're the ones that are sick. They're the ones who need someone to help them go to the bathroom and to bathe themselves. And so I think a passage like this kind of turns that table to be like, when do we need the help? And maybe we all do. And how can we think about that?
I also think the conversation about equity, you know, a lot of people like to pit Luke and Matthew against each other as gospels. They tell a lot of the same stories, but they might use different language or you know, tell things a little bit differently. And a major theme in Luke is the like care for people and like bodily needs. A lot of Matthew can be those like spiritual needs, you know. If you compare the Beatitudes, that's like a really classic example, like blessed are the poor versus blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke is really focused on poverty, and Jesus is having a meal with these people who are impoverished, or, you know, are people who are in need of something, right? Throughout the gospel. Maybe not in this case, since you have a tax collector, there's always an assumption that they're relatively wealthy. But I also wonder if they are not as wealthy as, or maybe some are wealthy, but others aren't. And they're also operating in a system that is unjust, that they're trying to like make ends meet. But if Jesus is there with these people that have these physical needs, it's also bringing our attention to them of like, these are perhaps the people who also have physical needs that we should care for in the sense of equity and what resources are available.
Well, and I wonder further is like, and that might just be in my reading of it and hearing it and not visualizing it, of like, I think there is an assumption there, and that there's an economic injustice between the people who are at this table fellowship, because I don't know if there is.
That's
right. Right. And so it's holding like, how can we think of needs outside of an economic context? I think is something that I think, and maybe that's like a privileged thing. Like I'm someone who has kind of been a class hopper in my own life, and thinking through like, it's really, really hard for a lot of middle class people to think about what are my needs when a lot of my like, you know, if we think of a Maslow's hierarchy, right? We think we have our shelter, we have our food, we have all of these things. You know, we have our 401k. And like, what are those needs what are those needs beyond just this, this moment, and those kind of pieces that we don't, especially in capitalism, right, that we don't think beyond the material.
Yeah. And even we the way that we are conditioned is to look at needs and not strengths.
Yeah.
And like, what if Jesus is also like paying attention to the strengths of this community? And when I think of like fellowship, when I think about like meals, typically those are really like joyful experiences in my life. That's where I feel really connected to people. And as you were talking, Jayde, I was thinking about the book that I'm reading currently called The Black Joy Project, that is taking a critical lens to the experience of Black joy, which is often not a narrative that is focused upon, you know, because there are definite like racial inequalities, a lot of disparities due to racial and ethnic identities, and to only focus on the negatives takes away from the experience of joy and the way that joy can be in many ways like rebellious and can be against authority, because it can take a lot of courage to, and the way to survive is to cultivate joy. And so also thinking about this table, right, if you look beyond the needs approach, if you're looking at like, maybe this is a group of people who like love really deeply and Jesus wants to spend time with them and is recognizing the gifts that they have coming from their experiences and wants to channel some of that.
Yeah. And as I listen to both of you talk, I think back to what we were talking about first, as far as like who, like, how do we decide who's the sinner and who's not? And it's the same as like, how do we categorize the sick versus the well? Like, is it even your point? How do we find a strict line of low class, middle class, high class? Like, how do we draw those lines to decide who needs Jesus's attention and who doesn't? And I think the answer is you don't. And something that I feel like I always end up bringing up on podcasts, because this was such a big part of my faith journey, especially like growing up being really active in the church. And then once my parents got divorced, kind of falling out of it and coming back to it, is this sense of like almost performative religion, where it's like, I read my Bible every day. I draw pretty pictures in the margins, and I've gone on X number of mission trips. Like, how do you then not justify, but how do you then call yourself a better Christian than someone else? Like, how do you draw that line? And then are you saying, oh, I need Jesus more than you do because I don't draw pretty pictures in the margins of my Bible, to put it very loosely? But how do you draw those lines?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Do you have any thoughts that come up for you first? I think because I'm really wrestling with this as we're thinking about it. And
I think it's so human, because as humans, we want to put things in nice little neat boxes.
My God, I love a
good box. I'm like, what's right, what's wrong, what's fair, what's not fair.
Yeah. I think like some people who listen to this might be familiar with the work of James Cone. And I think this idea of Jesus, like, so James Cone uses this framework or presents a framework where he talks about like Jesus being Black. And I remember people in my seminary classes, I don't know how it was for you, but I remember some people, they were really struggling. Some of my fellow colleagues, especially my fellow white colleagues, they were not okay. And let alone, I'm not sure if they were okay with Jesus being brown either, but like
Palestinian.
And right? So hard.
Culturally accurate.
So uncomfortable for folks. But this idea that Jesus is, and we can understand Jesus as like the oppressed of the oppressed in the moment in history that he came into, as being a Palestinian Jew under Roman occupation. And I think, because what I wrestle with is, I do wonder, I think, so if Jesus came, if we're gonna use Luke, in this Luke 4 passage, which I do think is important right before this, that he has come to set the captives free, to give sight to the blind, and like all of these different things, this emancipatory proclamation. And then we filter into this, like, I think we might be able to argue that like, sometimes other people do need the good news more than other people. And what does it mean for those of us who have taken up so much oxygen, taken up so much of the resources for, no offense, my church, I love you, for our buildings, for our roofs, for our families, our family celebration centers, our programs, what we spend on mission trips, what our denomination spends on annual conference, on general conference. Yeah. And thinking about, is this how Jesus would want us to live? Is this what an equitable sharing of resources looks like?
Right.
Is this actually a need? And are we meeting our need with how we're spending this money? And I think like Jesus choosing to be with these people at this meal, regardless of their needs. And I'm even thinking about Jesus's own needs to connect with people, right? To have fun, to be with people who aren't like maybe making him crazy like the Pharisees, who are going to be a part of getting him yeeted, right? And so there is this piece here that I think is really important that I don't fully know what to do with.
Yeah.
Right.
And I'll even throw this out there. Annual conference 2 years ago, I think, which, side note, Anna made a bingo for, and it was the only thing that got me through those 3 days. And I have to tell you that I went back, found that text, used that website to make a bingo for spending Christmas with my family in Jacksonville.
That's
Incredible.
It was the only thing, again, that got us through that week, side note. But as you were talking about, are we really spending money in the right way? And also, who can make that decision? At that annual conference, one of the things that I come back to the most is one of the groups during their presentation brought out a t-shirt cannon and was shooting t-shirts into the audience. And it's like, on the surface, that feels so unnecessary, because then you bring up the finance person who's talking about, disaffiliation and the impact that all of that money leaving the conference budget is having. And we really don't have the money right now. Yeah. But then you've got people like shooting t-shirts into the audience. And so on the surface, that feels unnecessary. But I also think about, we were coming off a really hard annual conference the year before. Yeah. Like, how would that have changed attitudes if there wasn't that moment of joy? So then, was it worth it? And then we come back to the question of, who can even say if it's worth it or not?
Yeah.
I think I am a white person. I feel like white people often operate in a space of scarcity as well. Yes. And, there's then like, sorry, I'm getting over bronchitis and airway. It's been a journey. 2025 has not been kind to me. So my voice keeps going in and out. I think a scarcity mindset, when we're trying to like control as many resources as possible, it also like doesn't allow for like the unexpected ways that people gather resilience and like create joy spontaneously. Like, I don't want to appropriate the saying because it's not from my culture, but the idea that like God makes a way out of no way, like I do think that runs true. And like God does work for the good of God's people. Which isn't to say we should like fire our finance people, right? But like when we're thinking about the things that we're prioritizing, right? Like, in what ways do churches prioritize opportunities for joy? I mean, that's one of my biggest complaints about the church sometimes is that it gets like so stressed out about its own business that it like forgets to be human.
Right.
And like part of being human is to, be silly and like buy a little silly treat for yourself and, enjoy it. And there's a way you do it reasonably, responsibly. It doesn't take away from like the people who are unfairly paid, like the pay discrepancy between black clergy and white clergy. I mean, those things don't go away.
Right.
And like, if we're always operating from a scarcity mindset, that also tends to take away resources from people 100%. Who are disenfranchised.
Yeah. No, I think that's it. And I think that's a really important part of this text. And I think that's a really important thread of Luke and Acts, is because like we're supposed to read Luke and Acts like a 2-part volume, right? And so like Luke is paving this way of like, what is the future of the church? And so as we think about this table, and I think Jesus is being, and I wonder, as you were saying that, if like Jesus's response to the Pharisees is not even just that like, these people need a doctor, calm down. I wonder too, if it's like, do you not trust God to be big enough to meet all of these needs?
Wow.
Right. Yeah. That like, can God not do whatever God needs to do for the people of Israel and also everybody else? But that's really hard to trust. That's like, I think, especially for institutions looking at decline like the church is, that's really hard.
Mm-hmm. This is going to feel like a sharp tangent, but it when you were talking, Tess, about like what it means to be a perfect Christian in many ways, like I think about my work at the hospital where like people are receiving diagnoses that are often very life-threatening and are trying to figure out like, how do I, integrate this into my reality? And there is an assumption of like, oh, these people need Jesus, need God. And like, I've done a lot of research actually on like the narratives of patients and the narratives we put upon patients. There's this idea that like, oh, if you are really hopeful and like happy and, fearless as you're approaching treatment, then you'll have better health outcomes. And there's, clinical studies that have in ways proven that. And like, who are we to put a narrative upon someone? Who are we to put perceived needs upon them? And there's plenty of people that go up to my patients and say, everything happens for a reason and God has a plan for you. And like, if that person after the, being in their journey does make that decision for themselves, like, who am I to say that's not how God is working in their life? And like, who are we to assume how God is, who are we to assume what their needs are? Who are we to assume how God will and is going to meet their needs? Because we do ourselves harm when we think of what are these narratives of what makes a perfect Christian, a perfect patient, perfect human, like
the right thing to do, like that perfect path forward of this is what you should be doing X, Y, and Z to get to this perfect outcome. And it's just, that's not what being human is.
And it's not what it means to avoid sin. I think to take it back to the passage, right? Like if we're talking about like who is a sinner, like within the framework, right? Like, is perfection the opposite of, is perfection and sinlessness the same thing? I would say no.
The Hebrew would also say.
Just throwing that out there. But yeah, because what if you're a perfect tax collector, but you're still a tax collector at the end of the day? Like, where do you fall in that spectrum?
I think this is, I'd be loving the sheep and the goats passage. A lot of people don't like it.
Jade has a goat tattoo.
I do have a goat tattoo, but it's not for the the whole message of that passage is to not be a goat. But I do really love that example of like, these are the things that we should be doing, right? Like I'm in a program to be a spiritual director right now. And so like one of the things that we've been reading about and talking about right now is religious experience. And like, it's been a really interesting thing for me to think about coming out of like more evangelical Methodist churches, right? And not all of them that I've served, but some of them in particular that really put this high value on personal experience with God, which, and those things are important. They matter so much to so many people who have these experiences. But one of the things that the book was talking about is like, these experiences matter. But when we think in a framework of Christian spirituality, is we're thinking about how do these experiences help inform us show up as daily followers of Christ, right? And I think what I see in this passage is Jesus asking me, like, who is there room for at my table? Or not even my table, God's table, right? Like, where is there room for myself, my imperfections, my perfections? I don't have many perfections. And all that I am, right? And who is it hard for me to make space to that God might be inviting me to make space for? Or even do I have that power? Maybe God is already saying like, they have a chair and you need to deal with it and you need to work on whatever is in you to make the space.
The piece that I kept coming back to from this is just the very definitive, like when he's questioned, Jesus is like, yeah, they're here. These are who I invited. No problem with it at all. Just almost deadpan in a sense. But the Pharisees are sitting here questioning. And like, as I'm reading this, I'm fully picturing like very much side eye. Because I think it also mentions, they don't ask him. They ask his disciples. Like, they
triangulate.
They complain to his disciples. This is also
good catch.
To picture this, like now I have it up, but they're complaining to his disciples, and then Jesus answers them directly. So I'm fully just expecting like the Pharisees are over here like whispering and
Yeah.
side-eyeing, and Jesus is like, A, I heard you,
Yeah.
and B, this is how I'm going to respond to it.
Yeah. I'd be loving that boldness. I love that of like, imagine I'm talking poorly about Tess to you and Tess being like,
What'd you say?
And yeah, like
say it to my face.
Say it to my face.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, and I think too, I experience it kind of like you're saying, the deadpan is like Jesus feels very unbothered.
Yeah.
And it's like he on it, and you know, we don't have the full story. Right. Luke gives us this little picture and we move on to other things.
It's a total of 5 verses.
Right.
Like,
it's not a lot.
it.
But two, that like Jesus doesn't spend a lot of time explaining to either party.
Yeah.
He doesn't really address it with the whoever the sinners are, with the Pharisees, with the tax collectors, with his disciples. He's like, this is not that deep.
Right.
Here's my words. I'm gonna move on.
Yeah. Like that's it. And then they finish eating.
How often do I try to over-explain myself? Be so nice in my emails and I think I'm being rude, right? Or these things that if Jesus is just like, this is what matters.
Yeah.
So it makes me think that sometimes just saying the truth is enough. You know, like when Jesus is just, those people's opinions are not important to him. So he is just going to say the truth and move forward.
Yeah.
It was so unimportant. They didn't even say it to him, you know, like he really does not care what they think.
But isn't that so human though? Like, I think about being in churches, right? And I remember this even before I was a pastor of like, you get a new pastor and the lay people are like, you're going to be here for 4 years. This is my church.
Right.
And then talking to their fellow church people about how they feel about the clergy or about how they feel about this. Oh, excuse me. Or how they feel about this, and never engaging directly with that person.
Not saying, hey, this is how I need you to show up for me. I know this community better than you do. Like, this is what we need from you. Instead, they just like,
or just not even having a conversation about it, right? Like, I'm gonna get irritated,
not tell you what you're doing.
Gossip,
yeah,
but I'm not gonna engage
because that happens so often.
Yeah,
like
everything. Everything.
Yeah.
And it makes me think the Pharisees aren't actually asking the question, right? It maybe perhaps it's intended to be rhetorical of like, why would you do that?
Yeah,
and Jesus gives them a real answer.
Yeah. So another piece that kind of caught my attention, definitely not the first time that I read it, but as I went back to it and as I looked at it in other translations, is Levi at the very beginning of this. Like Jesus says, follow me. And sweet little Levi, it says, got up, left everything and followed him. And we, on Annex, we often talk about like how strong the choice of certain words is. Like, it's not just Jesus said, follow me, and we assume that Levi follows him, but like it's got up, left everything and followed him.
Yeah. That's the hard part about these kind of stories for me, of that question of what is the length of which I am comfortable or called to go to. For me, it's like for the sake of justice, right? For the sake of liberation. And that's a really hard question. Like, I don't know. There's times I've talked to with my own spiritual director of like, if that's what God's asking, it's not really what I want to do.
Yeah.
Because it can get very uncomfortable.
I think for me, it's also discerning how the call is being said. I think I struggle sometimes with like the clarity of what God is calling me into, where it's hard for me to imagine even the response, because sometimes it's so hard for me to discern the language, right?
Yeah.
Like how, like if God said, do this, I'd probably be like, okay, sir. Like, yes, ma'am, you know? I of course, you know? And maybe that is not how I would respond, right? But if there's someone asking me to do things, I'm much more likely to do it. If it's a verbal response, if it's someone I see, someone that I've heard about, that I respect a lot, that asks me to, I'll go, right? It sounds like a good time. Versus for myself, I feel like the struggle that I have is discerning, like, where am I being called to? I think I'm someone who gets called in a lot of different directions constantly, and it's hard for me to follow the strands sometimes. And so then it's, how can I settle? It's similar to the comment you had earlier, Jayde, about, you know, these like big religious experiences and the merit we put on them. Like, if I had a dream where God herself was like, Anna, I need you to do this, that is easier for me in some ways to turn back to and be like, oh yeah, I have such clarity about that. I'm an 8 on the Enneagram. I'm a body triad. I feel things very deeply. I only operate on instinct. It does not matter what you tell me. It matters. I'm going to follow the gut. So
I am completely opposite.
I know. I'm like,
you better give me every fact there's ever been. You better cite your research and tell me why I'm doing what you think I should do.
No, I will jump off the bridge if my gut tells me to jump off the bridge. No one has to do it in front of me, but if my gut says to do it, I'm going to do it.
I'm a 3.
I'm a 6.
Okay.
So we moved in similar spaces.
Yeah, we wing. Or not wing, but whatever the thing is.
Distressing.
Yeah. Those lines.
So I follow my gut, and sometimes your tummy hurts, and it's hard to tell, like, what do you do? What do you do when it hurts? And so I have, for myself, if God is telling me, follow me, I don't know. It's muffled.
Well, and I think that's why community is important, right? And that's like, it's not just Levi and Jesus. Like, there's all these other people figuring it out. And so when I think about like myself, my practices, my community, it's thinking about, how do I structure this so that way, like, the things that I have heard, or the things that, because I think we think about God as this like man in the sky, and he tells us things sometimes, and he expects things of us always, and I do think God expects things of us always, but I do think, like, we have scriptures like this, we have incredible people in our lives who have modeled what it means to follow the life of Christ. And so what does it look like to just take the next right step, or to make the wisest decision with what we have in front of us? Because I think there's a humility in that that's really hard. I always want to get it right. I do not want to mess up. I don't want a learning curve. Nope. But that's just living. And thinking about, like, how do we figure out how not to just count on the dreams or the gut? Because I think sometimes the dream and the gut could just be the Doritos, like you said, or the tummy hurts. And figuring out, like, how do we go to scripture? Do we go to our friends, to our, like, elders, and all these people and experiences to think about what might God be inviting us to do?
And even in a very real sense, I'm college senior, applying to jobs, all of these things. And I would like to think that I have a very clear picture of what I want to do with my life. But then with every, like, job that I apply to, and a week later hear back and say, no, we went with a different candidate. Like, is that God telling me that I need to choose a different career path? Like, is that one rejection the thing that I'm supposed to be listening to? Or, like, I got an invitation for an interview, but it's with a nonprofit, and I had kind of moved more towards the corporate side. And so I'm like, what if this is, a reminder that this was where I wanted to go, but now I'm going in a different direction? And what do I do if this is then the only option that I'm given, but it's below the pay that I want to accept? Like, all of these things, it's hard to, I think, discern, if the idea is God is telling me something, how do I discern which part is the message? Like, which message am I supposed to be listening to?
And, it makes me think that everything happens for a reason, right? That theology is so embedded in how we think and how we, experience faith and try to, imagine how God is working with us in the future. I think a lot of my spiritual journey has been really looking at God's power in the universe and how do I think God is acting in the universe? Do I think God is a puppeteer moving the places where it's God is telling me this through this one email, right? I think something that when I was a senior in college, Dan Wunderlich of Florida elder told me I was trying to discern through a bunch of different paths, and he was just like, Anna, I don't think God cares. And I was like, what?
Like, what did you just say to me?
And he was like, Anna, like, I just have so much faith that like God is going to do amazing things in your life. Like, I don't think God cares about how the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. Like, and as I've gotten older, I have a different theological framework that I think that everything happens for a reason one. And I think so much more about how I am co-creating with God every step of the way. And so like, no matter what opportunity comes ahead, like God and you will create it together. God's not necessarily leaving you breadcrumbs, but God is like maybe some like glasses you have on that is helping you to perceive the world, to help you think through where can I really tap into God's spirit and like where I feel the most fulfilled, like where do I feel happy, where do I feel like my strengths are being used, because I think God like wants us to feel fulfilled in that, you know, and maybe it's nonprofit, maybe it's corporate, maybe, you know, and sometimes like we've talked about this a lot, sometimes you have to try it out and like trust that like there aren't wrong decisions, there's just like that was good for this time, right? And I think we think so much about life as a linear path, then we lose sight of the fun little web that God creates with us, where in the most unexpected ways God shows up and we get to create with them.
Yeah. And one of Derek's, so every time that we as interns have a one-on-one with Derek, he asks us two questions. One is, how is your soul? And the second is, what is the last thing that you heard God say to you? And the last time that I talked with him, we really dove into that second question, because my answer was kind of like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what I've heard, if anything, recently. And then is that a God's not saying anything, or is that a I'm not listening? Is it somewhere in between? And so as you're saying that, I think back to this understanding of like, you know, God could be saying all of these things. What if I only hear this one piece? And that's okay, because then to what you said earlier, Jayde, you do what you can with the information that you have. Like, you make the best decision based on the information that you had. And like, I don't think it's fair to expect any of us to pick up on every little clue or every little breadcrumb that God may or may not be leaving. Because so often I think we fall into the trap of like, oh, everything happens for a reason. I know exactly why this one thing happened to me. And it's not true. And sometimes things just happen and we try to interpret it. And I think, you know, if you can grow from that insight that you're projecting on it, that's one thing. But if you're saying this thing happened for a reason, I know exactly why it happened, and then just move on, like what is the point of that? There's no growth that can come from that.
I think a big thing for me is like, I have an understanding of God. And I think that you were kind of mentioning this too, of like tapping in. Like I very much see God. And I think this is something that matters in the Gospels too, right? Is like God takes on flesh and dwells among us. Like there is the incarnational element. And so for me, like God is presence. And I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, and I was like a very lonely child, did not, I was just like vibing. And like, we weren't really religious. And I remember I would go out. We had this porch in my backyard, and I would just look up and see the stars. Anna makes fun of me because I truly believe, and I think Google has told me this, that like the stars are brighter when it's colder, and like the farther north you are, they feel closer. But you know, whatever. That
Jayde loves to say this on like cloudy nights. It's like
it's
cold. She's like, true. You see the stars so when it's cold. I'm like, Jayde, there's a cloud. Like, what do you right? Like, when clouds are affecting the sight.
But no, like I remember going on the porch as a kid and like seeing the stars and feeling less alone. Right. And I think that is very much my experience of God is like, God is that which makes me feel less alone. And like helps me navigate all of the things, all of the struggles, all of the joy. Right. Because I think it has to be, I can't remember who said this, but like joy is a form of resistance. And like joy is the bread for the journey. Joy is how we can continue. But sometimes like all we can do is sit before we take another step, depending on like what is our lot, how has life been going, and that some way, somehow God is with us in all of that, which is just crazy.
Yeah. Any last thoughts, last insights on this text or anything that we've talked about?
I'm just so grateful for this time, for this like really cute idea that you had to invite us to be a part of it. I think too, is just really exciting, and to hear what y'all are doing at your college ministry.
Yeah. And the fun, I think the Bible/scripture is seen as a rule book, a guideline. And I think just taking the time to talk about the things that come up in your own self. You start off being like, let's have the clergy really talk about it. But I think like the most fruitful reflections just come from your personal experience. And so being able to, really read a text, read it carefully, really let it speak, and not trying to find the breadcrumbs, just being like, what does this bring up for me? And having conversation partners to do with it, I think is just very fun.
Yeah. And I think for clergy too, especially as someone, like I used to be a pastor, and like when you preach every Sunday and you get very, at least me, maybe everyone else is better than I was, is you can get desensitized to like that this is a holy text. And what does it mean that we think God can still speak to us through this? And I think, at least speaking for myself, I think as a clergy person, I can lose sight of that. And it matters so much to be in relationship with laity to remind me that this is a good and a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And that was one of the main, I think, drivers behind starting this podcast series in general, was when we ChatGPT'd a slogan for this last week, was it actually spit out something that we all loved, which was making the sacred feel ordinary and the ordinary feel sacred. We're like, how can we just sit and talk about such a like sacred text while we're drinking vanilla Coke and Diet Coke and eating
she's empty
and eating Easter candy and just sit here and talk about it and make it feel more like a piece of everyday life than something that you show up for on a Sunday morning.
And that only certain people have the authority to read. I think that's a hard thing for me, is that we say this, the preacher is the most qualified to read this and tell us how it impacts our lives, when like the reality is we all have that agency. We each have our own, we each have our own voice, and each of our experience is really valuable, because we each are going to bring out different elements of the text depending on our personal experience.
There's one of my favorite quotes is that God is found in your ordinary life. And I think that is so important to these kinds of things. So thank you for giving us the opportunity.
Absolutely. And then this one's for Mr. Sam Stiles Williams, because I know you'll be listening to this. Sam ends every episode of Annex by saying, "And all God's people said bye." And we're going to end this series, this Holy Spirits, by saying, "And all God's people said cheers."
Love it.
Even though Jayde had, there we go. Cheers.
Thanks for tuning in to Holy Spirits, a Studio Wesley Annex series. This podcast is produced by the team at Wesley's Revival, and in accordance with UMC Social Principles, all individuals consuming alcohol during our recordings are of U.S. legal age and drinking responsibly.